Good day. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I am Blake. I'm here with Kyle and Doug. We are all pastors at Living Springs Church, and this is a podcast where we get to take you on an adventure as you guys ask questions and we give answers sometimes.
When we can.
Yeah.
We respond.
We respond, and then there's opportunity for AER, which is, again, you can accuse us or explain some things, or we can recant some things that we said. But
We can even accuse one another.
that's true. Yes.
We don't have to wait a week to do that, though.
No, that's
No, we
exactly
can do that right away.
Unless we're secretly doing it anonymously through that Doug said. Yeah. That's the way you could do it.
Right on. Well, if there's no other banter and intro, then we can jump right into questions to you.
There's no AER this week.
No.
No AER, other than just, not actually AER, I'll plug now in case people don't make it all the way through the podcast. Not that we're out of questions yet, but we're getting closer than we have been for a long time. So I'll say the email inbox for questions has been a little bit light the last few weeks, so feel free to start putting them in if you have been waiting.
That's right. So I'll say this again at the end, but Inverted Orthodoxy is where you can find us.com. Sorry. And
Inverted Orthodoxy is where you can find us.com.
yeah, it's a long
That's a
name.
I'll have to buy a second domain name.
That's
I don't think there's much competition for that one.
Name.
InvertedOrthodoxy.com if you were listening or watching literally.
There you go.
And then you can find lots of tabs there where you can submit questions and keep them coming.
Yeah.
We would love to hear them. All right. So first question today. In your opinion, are churches with a younger pastoral staff / volunteer team likely to bring in more people?
Should we let the only not old man
That's what I was thinking. I
on
was
staff
like,
answer this?
All right.
it's like, I hope someone older than me submitted this question.
From
Anec-
Kyle's perspective, there's not many people older than us.
Yes, this is probably true.
I'm never going to live that one down. am I?
Never, ever,
Good thing
ever.
it's not like you're going to live that much longer for me to have to live it through very much. But had to give it back.
That was good.
All right. Anecdotally, I don't know if it would bring in more people, but it would bring in more young people, if that's what you're aiming for. To a degree, I would say I've also seen a lot of scenarios where there's a really young pastoral team or staff, and because they're young and have no wisdom, they drive everybody out the door because they don't know how to organize things and present things or don't have a level of wisdom. I'll say it depends on what you're looking for, and I would again, anecdotally, look at North American church and say, stealing from Scott McKnight, we have a over youthfulness problem. We have neglected wisdom for the sake of youthfulness. And so because that is the culture the majority of us have been, at least I would assume those especially listening, have grown up in, we are often looking for that, and we've overemphasized experience, I think, sometimes in church, and so that comes in lots of different forms of super charismatic speaking, really engaging in performative music, and lots of different programs for specific individuals and niches. And so that is really well, if I could put it this way, as bluntly as it is, it's just really good marketing, which is often a younger kind of way of thinking about things. What I will put into major question is just drawing more people the right move. And I would argue no, very quickly. And so I think there needs to be a balance. I think you can have church staffs that are on either end of a negative spectrum. I think the church is supposed to be representative of the people of God, young and old. So I think there's a wisdom to having a mix of everybody on there. So you have wisdom as well as a youthful culture and perspective as well, blending, and then all coming together to meet everybody where they're at.
I 100% agree with our North American culture's idolization of youth.
Yep.
We very much do. We want to stay young.
Yep.
We want to be young. We want to live like we're young.
Yep.
And it's a weird thing when you stop and think about it. And maybe you don't because you're not old yet. But the older I get, the more I'm like, there's value in getting older and in gaining perspective that you can't get without the length of time that it takes. So it's interesting to me when I see people who are older who are constantly trying to be younger. And I think if you have an old pastoral staff that's trying to be young and hip, you're going to be in a world of hurt.
Also true.
Because I do think young people, especially in today's world, can smell inauthenticity.
Yep.
And they just are not at all into that.
Yep.
So I think that you have to be yourself, and whatever that looks like. I think there's also a reality to the fact that every church goes through a life cycle.
Yep.
I think we cling to our churches, sometimes long after their due date, because Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail. So the church is always going to continue to grow. And that is true, but that doesn't mean that, every individual assembly is going to grow forever.
Correct.
If you go to the ruins of ancient Corinth and you look around, all those churches are gone.
Yep.
And if you go through Europe, you see lots of churches that the building still exists, but it's basically just a tourist attraction now.
Yep.
There's not a guarantee that a church is going to survive.
Yep.
There is only the promise that Christ's church will continue to grow.
Yep.
So I think that it's okay to recognize there's a life cycle. I think it's okay to recognize if you're on the older part of that life cycle that you can make some intentional changes to change that life cycle. And I've heard of churches that have done that, where a church has started to get older, and over the course of realizing that, they've intentionally made some adjustments, oftentimes to the discomfort of the older church, to make space for younger people to come in, because they saw that the future was going to be held in bringing in some younger people, and those younger people are going to do things different. They're going to like different things. They're going to want different things, but they've seen the need and recognize the desire to have the church do that. But every individual church has a life cycle.
Yep.
And so where are you in that? And what are you doing about it? I think those are all valid.
Yeah.
Over and above all of that, though, I do think of the book It by Craig Groeschel, where he just talks about some churches have it and some churches don't.
Right. Yep.
And if you read the book, you know the spoiler. It is the Spirit of God.
Right.
And if you are a church that is alive in the Spirit, that is doing a good job of loving people, of helping people, of teaching people the way of Jesus, I think you will grow.
Yeah.
I remember a number of years ago, like just in prayer one day, and I felt like God said, if you focus on broken people, you'll always have a job.
Right.
And I remember responding saying, but broken people don't have money.
This is so true.
Yeah.
And he was like, yes, but you'll have a job. And I'm like, but I'd also like a paycheck. But thus far, I've never missed a paycheck.
There you go. I remember Tim Keller, his book. This is one of the first books that I jumped into that I was really challenged thinking about my ecclesiology. He was challenging, saying churches should be really focused on getting into urban areas for the sake that they would then be able to access younger people, and culture is formed about 10 years ahead in university settings, he was saying, and then comes to the rest of the wider culture as those students go into professions and then have impacts on their workplaces and politics and all the rest. And so he was saying for the church to be able to speak to its current state of culture, to have younger people involved, was a necessary component that he was pursuing as a result of realizing some churches were aging really quickly and not able to then reach that next generation without those intentional moves. That was one that he tried to make, of like, make sure we have a university focus, not in the population of their church, but as a part of their church, so they could hear those things and move along with culture. Kara Powell, I think it was, Growing Young, something like that. She talks about church development too, and the ability to see people of every age demographic represented in visual parts of your church will allow other people of those same demographics to come. And she was speaking specifically about younger people, but I think that's really valuable to consider in all places. For your older people to come, you don't want to just feel like, I'm too old and whatever, can't connect here. You want people there. You want people of different racial minorities and all that to be seen, to say, we clearly have space and expression and value. You are seen here. Whatever your demographic or background is helpful. And again, I wouldn't want to over or under aim for one of those and what a church looks like.
I think you kind of mentioned a thing that makes me think, when I read this question, it has an assumption that we get to choose who our pastoral staff will be.
Right.
And staff is also an assumption that you have a church that has multiple staff.
Right.
Because I think there's many churches in North America anyways that are so varied in what a church looks like, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're in a city, then you probably have the option of a few more churches to choose from. If you're looking for a church, you probably have some churches that are bigger that have multiple staff, you have churches that are just, home groups or like maybe not even paid staff, and the whole gamut in between in one city.
Yep.
But if you move in North America to any kind of rural setting, then the church experience changes drastically.
Totally.
Right? Depending on how many people come to the church, the demographic of the area, the life cycle of that particular area, not just the church.
Absolutely.
Right? I think of our church for sure. Like we are in the corner of what is now Airdrie, but we were talking this morning, 40 years ago when this church was built, it wasn't even inside the city limits.
Yeah.
Right? Airdrie's got very multicultural in the last 5 years, I would say, maybe 10, but
I think it's been 10 or 15. It's been growing, but it's more in the last 5 years. It's become very noticeable.
Right.
You've reached this tipping point with seeing the multiculturalism in Airdrie.
Yep.
So, all of a sudden we have new people coming from lots of different demographics because they live right here, like within walking distance to our church. That wasn't an option a few years ago. So then you think about staff and you're like, okay, who are you picking? Who are you hiring? If you're in a little Timbuktu town, you're not attracting the most experienced of church staff to take a pastoral role there. You usually get young kids coming out of college that, do those roles, right?
Yeah.
Well, not according to what I've heard lately, though, is that a lot of the kids coming out of Bible college won't go to those rural towns.
Okay.
Oh, hugely. Well, they're not joining pastoral staffs anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if they do join a pastoral staff, they want to be in a city.
Yeah, of course, because they want to be part of the big thing that they think is going on, right?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily that sounds like their attitude is wrong, but I think the majority of them grew up in an urban center.
Totally,
And
yes.
Going to a rural setting is a huge culture shift.
I agree with that, yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I just think, I agree with what you guys said about the question. If you have the option of picking staff, then there's probably value to all sorts of things. You probably attract the people that your staff connects with best.
Yeah.
That just makes sense. If you have an older guy that loves his older people, because that's his people, he's probably not reaching younger people. But younger people, how much of them are like reaching out to a 50+ crowd, right? Like that's just so.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of dynamics to this question, I just feel like.
Yeah.
So.
They did recognize a volunteer team in the latter part of the question, pastoral staff or volunteer team.
Yeah.
Likely to bring in more people. I know talking with my neighbor, Jennifer, she's over at the Anglican church here in town, just celebrating the amount of young families that they've started to see again in the Anglican expression here in Airdrie. And just trying to care for them well, right? And so put them into positions as well, I'm sure, to be able to be seen and nurtured there, which is neat.
I think, though, that your volunteer team is going to be an indication of the reality of your church demographics.
Yep.
And then the reality of your church demographics are probably going to directly impact who might start coming to your church.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? Because if you are the only people in your 20s and you walk into a church and it's full of gray hair,
Yep.
it may be a wonderful service. There's just going to be a sense of, do I fit in here?
Correct.
And on the flip side, if you are an older couple or an older person and you go to a church that
Everybody's
is
25.
full of 20-year-olds, even if you enjoy the music, you're young at heart, all of that, there is a sense of there's no community for me here, because we want church to be, when church is done well, it's more than just a place we go.
Yep.
It is a community we belong to.
Yeah.
And so is both of those things.
Yeah, I would say too. These are speaking in broad generalities. Just quickly coming to mind, like Randy Carter. Give him a shot. I don't know if you ever watched the podcast, but Randy's nearing retirement, and there's nobody of any age that isn't going to come in and feel like they're seen and cared for and loved with a guy like Randy there. He transcends age in a lot of ways. Like thinking of him, and there's a lot of people I've met in my life that would represent that too. And so you can go, there's a Randy here. I don't care who else is around. Like those kind of things too.
But that's the Spirit of God part.
Yep.
Right? There's an element of that. And I think we all know We've all met those people who are just saints, who are the people that are just very much like Jesus, and they draw people to them because of the very genuine love they have. And I think whatever age the pastoral staff, whatever age the volunteer team, whatever average age of the church, if they are growing in an understanding of their belovedness as the child of God, as a child of God, and as children of God, and they are sharing that love with those, they will draw people to them.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
All right, next question. What do you think about hats in church? I grew up with the idea that it's disrespectful for men to wear a hat in a church. But when talking to my son, I had no real reason to base this on other than the scripture in 1 Corinthians 11. But I'm sure if that was cultural then, or if it is still, or I'm not sure if that was just cultural then, or if it is relevant now.
I just want to begin by saying, if it's a Toronto Blue Jays hat, it's
always
offensive
offensive
to wear it in church, yes, or anywhere else.
Fair. Well, funny enough, I actually brought this passage into my message on Sunday.
That's what I was going to let you start after I throw my little
because I
comment.
thought you did awesome on Sunday.
It was bringing in case for the listener not familiar with 1 Corinthians 11 off the top, talking about how a woman should cover her head, and it's shameful for her to have a shaved head or to have an uncovered head, and males the opposite for them to cover their head. And we look at this and we're just blown away. Like, this doesn't make sense. And we're almost offended. I would say offended by it. I think the stats I was looking at, I could pull them up from my notes. I had them in case I wanted to use them. It was Cardis and the Bible Society of Canada in 2023 did some surveys. I think it was 26% of respondents said they felt that the Bible sometimes was sexist. There's indications about racism and all that as well within it. But that one really jumped out at me in preparation for that message, speaking of Mary letting her hair down. I'm really thankful for Dr. Cynthia Westfall, who I read her awesome book, Paul and Gender, that talked about this. And the idea of hair coverings for a woman was something that was reserved for a special social elite. Those who were free women, which was already a narrow group, and free women who were sexually pure and therefore had not been abused in some way, which again, unfortunately, that even narrows it much further. And that was the cultural standard. And Paul, and I like to speculate, there's nothing that indicates this clearly, but I like to speculate, Paul probably got this from Jesus, of encouraging all women, whether they were allowed to or not, by cultural standards, to cover their heads. Yeah. And so when Paul does that, he's actually bestowing an honor that culture reserved for a special few. He's saying all women are worthy and deserving of this. The hair was the highest form of a woman's beauty. And therefore, to protect that was giving her a lot of value over herself, something that was needed in a culture that otherwise it would have been robbed from women without such reservations. So when Paul's doing this, I think he's speaking to a culture of his time and not something that we apply now. So if somebody's going to bring the necessity for a man not to wear a hat, I think you then have to follow with the opposite side and say, then we should have all women covering their heads. Which, if we are not applying that, I would say we can't apply either. There is a cultural level of respect that I grew up with that was applied universally, and that's where I was most comfortable with it. Because I wasn't allowed to wear a hat in school, my parents would often mention wearing a hat in any public building, even like malls and stuff. Like, that just wasn't a space. Church was no different. I mean, we're recognizing the cultural norms there as well as in church, and making sure to honor them to a better degree as a part of expression of worship. If that's where you're at, and the same standard you put for your son publicly in public buildings, period, great. I don't think there's anything biblically that indicates that, but cultural expression of Christianity has always tried to take into consideration cultural expressions for the sake of those outside the church recognizing it. And Paul cites this many times. What will those outside think? And so if the standard is recognizing the value of a public space and setting, not wearing a hat everywhere else, we'd be foolish to think that we have the ability to not set a good witness of discriminating or disregarding that when we come into our own worship setting.
Yeah. I think it's just worth reiterating the point you were making, that you made on the weekend, and that you're making, that Paul's talk about women and head coverings was elevating women in a culture that didn't elevate them. And because people haven't always done the homework to understand the original context, that that verse is now used to do the exact opposite
Yep.
of its original intent.
Yep.
And so I think that it is worth just reinforcing that.
Yep.
So I don't have any disagreement with anything you said. Yeah, I see people wearing hats in church, and I don't have any issues with it. It's one of those things. Although, so we have a couple that started attending our church years ago.
Yeah.
And they'd been coming for about 6 months, and I knew the husband. They
Yeah.
came on Sunday morning. Lorley came on Saturday night.
Yeah.
And so Lorley'd never met this couple.
Right.
And they walked in on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
And I'd gotten to know this guy fairly well. And he was wearing a Toronto Blue Jays hat. And I was standing beside Laura Lee when he walked in, and I smacked him in the arm. And I said, "You take that hat off in this building." And he knew that I didn't like the Blue Jays. And it was kind of, we'd always gone back and forth on
Yeah.
it. And so he laughed. And Laura Lee was horrified because she thought these are visitors
Right.
who'd never been in church before.
Yeah.
It was really awesome. It was a wonderful moment. I was like, no, if it was a better hat, I'd be fine with it.
Fair. Well, 2 stories to add to that. I'll say earlier in my tenure here, I had a few chances to speak, and I was wearing hats pretty regularly at that point. And you had no problem with me wearing a hat, but you said to me, and I really appreciated it, took it seriously. I don't think I wore a hat in the building after. Was if you want to be taken seriously, stop taking the hat or stop wearing the hat. And it wasn't at all that there was anything wrong with it, but you were looking at the position I was in and wanting to influence and pastor people.
And the position you wanted to step into.
Exactly. And so for people to take me more seriously, recognizing the cultural differences and cultural standard, that was something you expressed to me, and I took it seriously and took the hat off. Not because it was a barrier to my worship to Jesus
Yeah.
or anything like that, but for me to be able to speak and pastor our congregation, have to meet the standards and meet them where they're at, which was valuable input. And on the other side, that has often been a barrier, and unfortunately, this one was a much more serious but similar story to yours. A friend of mine in Moncton, when I was pastoring there, reiterated a story that he had growing up. This friend of his who he really wanted to get to church, spent months trying to convince him to come. The first Sunday came just as he was, walked in, hat on, and some elder in the church wanted to be the guardian of the church and knocked the hat off this young guy who my friend had spent months just like praying for him, wanting to get him to come to know Jesus, and not even into the sanctuary yet. And he's already been disrespected and hat knocked off. And the guy just picked his hat up, turned around and walked back out the door and never darkened the door of a church again, for the sake of this. And so I don't think conversations around hats should ever become a barrier for worship of Jesus, to emphasize that as we jump some stories into the question.
Well, I think this does speak to a larger narrative that I've heard people wrestle with about how do you dress to come to church? Because there's people who are like, well, if you're going to visit the Queen,
Yeah.
you would wear a suit. So why wouldn't you wear your best to come and worship God? Yeah. And there's an element of that where I'm like, but that is such faulty thinking, because God is everywhere and we can worship everywhere. We're just gathering together as the church to be together. We're not coming into God's house when we come to church. There's a real misunderstanding of what the buildings that we call churches are. And that's problematic. Number one is because we think I go to church. I don't. I go to a building where the church gathers. And so when we separate out the fact that we are the church and we're always in God's presence and God's Spirit dwells inside us, and we make a certain building or a certain time to be the place where I go visit God, there's going to be an element of, well, I should dress up and I should make it a special thing. In the same way that I think about, like, when Lorelei and I were dating. Like, if we were going to go out on a date, I would make sure that I would, look good and everything was. But when we got married and we lived together, not that I stopped caring, but she saw me in the morning. And you know what I mean? Like, it's different. And the love is deeper when you realize you're always with this person. If you do well. We're always in God's presence. And so there's not something special. And I think that elder in Moncton probably had a sense of, I'm defending God's honor, defending the honor of God's house, not realizing the building was just a building.
I think you and I have both read Leonard Sweet and Frank Viola's Pagan Christianity,
Yep.
where they talk about this is only a few 100-year-old problem. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and then the kind of easy access to textiles and all that to be able to make clothes and the development really of a middle-class dressing developed. And then all of a sudden it was pursuit to try to look nicer and nicer in church in this gathered setting, which is a social environment. Now you're trying to up one another, and then all of a sudden it gets expressive worship, but really I just want to look better than Martha over there, like whatever it may be. And that's a only a few 100-year-old development within church, not something that has been considered before that. Like other than the priesthood, vestments of clothes weren't really considered in church, and in much conversation that I've noticed, trying to be able to just recognize the season of the church for the priest. Other than that, it was you came as you were. Most people didn't have a lot of clothing available to have better clothes for Sunday till the last few 100 years.
So just on that line, and we're really off on a rabbit trail now.
Yeah.
But one of the parables of Jesus, that the first time I heard it, I didn't understand it. There's a wedding banquet, and the father of the bride invites all of his guests, and they don't show up.
Yeah.
So he sends out and he invites the lame, the crippled, basically those non-members of society in.
Yeah.
And that's where the wedding is happening. But then the story takes a turn because the father of the bride sees that one of the people, he gives them all wedding gowns, wedding apparel, and one of the people is not wearing the wedding apparel. And they're told, like, put on the wedding apparel. And the person's response is no. And then they're kicked out.
Yeah.
And like growing up, I'd read that story and I was like, what is going on here? So you got this guy who's like homeless, destitute, whatever word we want to use.
Yeah.
And he's invited to this wedding, and because he can't put on the fancy clothes, he ends up getting kicked out of the wedding.
Yeah.
Not understanding it's actually the exact opposite. When you went to a wedding 2,000 years ago, if it was a rich wedding, everybody was given attire to wear, and the attire everyone wore was plain and boring so that the bride and the groom stood out. And so the person who's not willing to put on wedding attire is not one of the poor people who's invited in. It's actually probably a rich person's friend who's coming in dressed in something better. And then what everybody else has got on. And he's being told, humble yourself and just put on normal clothes, like put on this thing so that you fit in with everybody else, so that it's all about the bride and the groom. And his unwillingness to do that is actually what causes him to get kicked out. And now 2,000 years later, we can have that same struggle where it's like, well, you got to be dressed up and go to church because you got to look your best. Whereas that parable, Jesus is talking about the reality of the fact that when you come to that banquet, everybody's wearing the same thing so that the bride and the groom stand out.
Well, not only that, but then you've got Paul's teaching, especially for modesty, all the verses that we've talked about a number of times here. That is not about modesty in the purity culture sense. It is about don't put on your fancy earrings and your bracelets and all those things Paul starts listing for women to try to dress better and stand out by your dress there. And even back to the hair covering, that again, that was the woman's most beautiful part, so put it up so it's not a distraction, and as an honor thing. And so it was don't try to stand out and put others down in your coming to church and to gathering, but get rid of any barriers that are going to divide you as a united group of people who are here to worship Jesus.
Yeah, I think of Jesus says, and it's biblical, like even through the Old Testament, we get these references where, God looks at the heart, right? He doesn't look at the outer parts of a human, right? Our dress or whatever. So I think of that. I'm like, yes, for anybody, that is desiring to be part of a church family and body, they should be able to be accepted right where they're at, right? But then I do think, like, if I'm speaking to a parent or someone trying to talk to their kids on this, with that same thought that God is looking at our heart, what is it that we can surrender? Because that's the big part of believing in Jesus and walking the way of God, is to be a surrendered person. How can I do that so that I bless others around me rather than drawing attention to myself, right? For myself, and I think everybody has their different ways of walking that out and what a surrendered life looks like. I often think of the environments that I'm going to be in that day, and then I dress so that I can, be of the best service to the people that I'm going to be around, whether I'm doing that for work purposes or whether I'm just visiting friends or family or anything. I dress differently compared to where I'm going to be because
Absolutely.
I want to be a non-distraction
Yep.
in that setting, right? Because
Totally.
I can wear the things I want to wear,
Yeah.
and I guess we're talking that way I have the freedom to do that, but then I could be a distraction to somebody else or a discouragement or just cause trouble,
Yeah.
right? So I think that if we are, as the individual, if we're surrendered to God, then that should be our heart, is how do we love God best?
Yes.
How do we love people best?
Yeah.
On the flip side, I shouldn't be judging anybody for the way they're dressed because I don't know their heart. Right?
Well, they don't necessarily have that same conviction.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you don't know all their story, and maybe it's just not something that God has impressed upon their heart. Like, I have to have grace every time you wear a Blue Jays shirt,
You do. And
it
do
discourages
greatly.
me. I'll tell you that. I'm like, this is my friend. And
Well, I pick and
this is
choose
the
who I
life-
surrender to.
this is
There
the
are
life
times I wear
choices
it
he's
very,
making.
very purposeful some days, Doug.
Oh man.
And you can't please everybody, right?
You should be endeavoring to please Jesus.
So Jesus doesn't like the Blue Jays?
That's what I'm saying. Yes, that is a conviction I have.
Wow. Okay. We're gonna get some AER on that one. Yeah.
All right. Next question. How does the ability to have free will come into play for heaven? With an option to choose, we would still have the opportunity to miss the mark or even choose evil. Yet if we don't have the option, then what's the point in having free will as we know it?
So I feel like this question is speaking to the classic Calvinist Arminian debate. And we did a podcast episode a number of months ago where we talked about the points of Calvinism.
Yep.
And
There's 2 episodes because
we did end up taking 2 episodes.
We did 2 episodes.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a very brief summary for those who might not be aware. The Calvinist argument would say, I don't think they would say you don't have a free will. You have a free will, but it's just God is the one that's basically
Controlling or
controlling
orchestrating
it all.
Yeah.
And there's different streams of Calvinism. So I don't want to paint it all with
gradients.
one brush.
Yeah.
Gradients. That's a good word. There's
That
different
would-
gradients of
that
Calvinism.
totally
So I
is.
don't want to paint it all with one brush. When you get into the very staunch Calvinist view, God has forechosen everything. Everything that happens is God's will. And therefore, I think this question becomes a valid one, which is how do you end up being punished for the decisions you made when God forechose and predestined all the
Yep.
decisions that you were going to make? And I would say that we probably would do a very bad job of representing that view because none of us are Calvinists.
I'm hearing the question in a different way, actually. I'm hearing, okay, we've died, we're in heaven. Do we still have free will? How do we exist in heaven and not sin, because there is no more sin there, and retain free will? That's what I'm hearing of the question.
Ah, that is a different way to take it. I didn't read it that
Oh.
way, but I like it. So continue. Answer it that way.
Okay. The way I've long tried to think about that is in 2 parts. One is that I think our wills will be purified, maybe that's the right word, enough, and removing the things of the brokenness of the world we live in now, that we will absolutely have free will, but our will be purified enough, not controlled, but purified to desire the right things. And so I don't think there will be a space for choosing evil and sin, not because we don't have the choice, but because we wouldn't make that choice. In the same way, I would try to articulate Jesus being here and living perfectly in a very similar way. His will was so in line with God that he had, yes, technically the ability to have sinned, but his will would have never led him there.
If he didn't have the ability to have sinned, then he couldn't say that he was tempted.
Correct. And so I would say we will face a very similar state in the new heaven and new earth. And then with that said, missing the mark, though that is, yes, the more literal, as far as I understand it, translation of what sin means, I think it leaves, it's left wanting a little bit, because it means if you're off even by a fraction, now you've done some moral evil, is the way I think most people understand it. We've gotten into the conversation here, though, that there are deepening levels of goodness that I think there will in heaven still be room to grow and lean into more and more goodness as we develop relationship with God and one another. So in that sense, there will be an ability to a degree miss the perfect goodness while still having space to grow into better goodness, if that makes sense. Or Adam and Eve, I think, were doing a lot, and I know I've come back to this. For them, they had lots of different ways they could have interacted with one another that weren't yet perfect. They were still good. They were not morally evil, but from those instances, they could learn to treat one another and their environment, like farming techniques. I've come back to that one a few times. They will grow into better and better ways to cultivate the land. That doesn't mean the first time that they stuck a seed in the wrong season, it was wrong, but there's room to grow into it. So I think we will still have a free will. We will still have room to grow into more goodness, but that we won't choose any moral evils. That's how I lay it out.
I would say it's not just the brokenness of the world that would be gone when we get to heaven, but also the sinfulness in our own nature.
Yes, I meant the totality of the universe, including ourselves.
But if when we say the brokenness of the world, that misses a giant part of our struggle.
Sure, yeah.
And my struggle, which is we're sinners.
Great clarification.
And we want to sin.
Yeah.
And that's part of the struggle. But I absolutely, other than that, I agree with you 100%. Although I would also say, so I actually screenshotted this. I believe it's Ken Tanner, who we've given shout-outs to before. Defining sin as missing the mark still misses the mark if we misdefine the mark as moral perfection rather than loving God wholeheartedly and loving our neighbor as ourselves.
Yep.
And so when we think about missing the mark as not loving, when we get to heaven, we will still have a free will. But the free will be, first of all, I agree with you. There won't be any temptation for sin because we'll see sin as it really is.
Yeah.
And there will be not a single part of it that we will find even attractive if we could find it.
Yeah.
But when we realize that the mark is loving, there's lots of ways to love.
Yep.
There's an infinite number of ways to love. So we will have free will, but that free will always manifest itself in the love and the benefit and the blessing of others.
Yep.
And so it's not that the free will will be like this idea we'll get to heaven, we'll all just sit on clouds and play harps and, like there's a loss
Count me out.
but there's a loss of free will there, right? Like there's this very constrained thing. I think of heaven, and I think of people who are living life fully, and part of living life fully is loving each other perfectly.
Yep.
And there will be no limit to the ways that we can love perfectly in our free will. Just think right now, if you have a friend and you want to bless and love that friend, you can think of 100 ways you could bless and love that friend.
Yep.
You have free will to choose the good. When we define the good as love, it doesn't remove the options of free will. In fact, it expands the options of free will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty and creativeness of our world that we currently live in, and what I assume and imagine heaven to be, because we're created by a God who is creative.
Yeah.
Like when you think of the world and universe he built, right? And I think that alone is exciting, right? And what you're saying, Doug, that we have all these different ways of showing love and showing, just creative ways to pursue God.
Yeah.
Which, I don't think ends in heaven. I'm glad you had the clarity. I was going to ask Kyle, I thought for a second you were saying there's no, that sin would be there and we could still be tempted. And I was like, that is not what I think of heaven, right? So,
I think there just still is a necessary free will, but our wills would be purified to not desire that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember the first time someone actually asked me that, and had a conversation about it. Imagine waking up in the morning and not being tempted. What a different way of living that would be, right? Just amazing. All right, next question. I was reading up on your church, and I believe it says that it follows the Apostles' Creed. In the Creed, it says that it follows the Holy Catholic Church. So the question is, does the church follow the Catholic?
So, little known fact about Kyle, he's 900 years old. And here you look very
And I
good.
call you the old one.
You look very good for your age.
Yes, he does. It does work out.
The Apostles' Creed does use the term Catholic, but you'll notice in the Creed it is a small c, not a large c.
Yeah.
The word Catholic means universal. And so you could, in the Creed, replace it with the word universal. We confuse small c Catholic meaning universal, with large c Catholic as in Roman Catholic, because the
Denomination,
Roman Catholic Church has taken that word and they've used it, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but they are what we think of as Catholics. And so when we talk about the Apostles' Creed and we use that word, it means universal. We believe in one universal truth. Kyle and I have discussed many times the replacing that word with universal so that it will be more easily understood.
So people don't have to ask this question and get it explained to.
But Kyle is, like I said, 900 years old.
Yep.
And he was there when this creed was written, so maybe 2,000 years old. And he's like, if it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for me.
In Greek.
Well, that is my argument that I've always made to you, is when this creed was written, it was not written in English.
Correct. So we've
we
translated
could
every other part.
use a different English word because they did not use the English word
They didn't
Catholic.
use any of the words there, for sure.
Correct.
And I recognize that, and you're not wrong in your thought process. My desire is in the purpose of using that one Catholic. So the line is, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Now, pairing those first three together, especially, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, and the communion of saints. For us to use the Apostles' Creed, which is recognized across denominational lines, across historical lines, across geographic lines, to celebrate the Catholic, the universalness of it, and the communion of saints, for us over here in our little tiny church to change the wording to help fit better, when all the other churches globally that speak English that cite this creed cite the word Catholic, I feel like we're breaking the thought of the universality of it and the communal part of it to say, but we're going to make it easier for our people to understand it. So we'll put in a different word to make it unique to our one setting to celebrate the community of the universal church. And that to me is kind of like, I'd like to keep it there to join in the unity that the statement means.
And I've said, fine,
Oh, I know you
because
have.
we've left
That's
it
why
there.
it's there.
Because I understand you care passionately about it, and I appreciate your argument. I always do. But I would, my response would again be, everywhere they recite the Apostles' Creed in another language, they're not using this word.
Totally.
And so it's just one of those things where it's neither here nor there, but it does come up occasionally. Whoever submitted this question, you're not the first one to ask this question.
Yep.
It gets asked in our membership class quite regularly because we don't advertise what denomination we are involved with on our website. We just focus on being the local church that we are and letting people come and experience who we are and the flavor of church we are without any preconceived ideas of that. So for some people, this is the first time that they're hearing anything that could be understood as denominational affiliations. And so they're like, oh, this is a weird Catholic church.
Some people, it's the first creed they've ever heard, too, coming from different backgrounds, right?
Yes, if they're from an evangelical church, they would not be familiar with any creeds. And so, for sure. Yep. But
All right.
in some ways, you're just so old.
One more question.
I think we can tack one more in.
All right. Is there a rite of passage particular for children that you think or should be implemented either into the church or into the community as a whole?
Yes, 100%. The Jewish people have bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs for girls, and it is a rite of passage that is just super cool. Funny story, beginning of COVID, I started an Instagram page called Daily Bible Discoveries, where every morning I read scripture and I just share my thoughts on it in a little video. And at one point, I was going through a good chunk of the Old Testament, and I started getting followed by a Jewish cantor. He's a guy who does bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs.
Wow.
And he still follows me, and I follow him. And this is literally in the Jewish community what his job is. He a lot of what he does. And so he will post pictures of his students at their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah as they're reciting part of the Torah that they've memorized, sometimes singing part of the Torah that they've memorized or some scripture they've memorized. And he will talk about the different things that as he's journeyed with this student, he's taught them as they're at this age where they're transitioning into adulthood. And I've watched that and I've been like, that is so amazing because we never have in our Western Christian, and I mean Christian like foundation, not that everybody's Christian, we never have those moments where we say, you're now a man, you're now a woman.
Yeah.
And I think that there are times where people have never had anyone speak that over their life, and it can be incredibly powerful for people and help them understand, okay, this is not just a rite of passage in that, look, I've arrived, but it also carries with it responsibility that I now need to begin to grow into.
Even culturally, we really don't have that other than you turning 18 and getting to be legally drinking.
Yes.
That's kind of what it is.
Which again, we've blurred the lines even on that one so much with
Yeah.
so many parents totally being okay with their kids doing that. And so both before and after, that's become a very blurred thing too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there would be something cool about that for sure. I think of my own kids, and I just think, this is it now, right? And the responsibility, I like that comes with that, right?
Yeah.
Just not all the blessing, but also the responsibility with it. So
There has long been built into churches, and it's only been in the last, I'd guess maybe really 70 to maybe 100 years where we've done away with a lot of that. And that might even be overstretching. It might even be more narrow. You've had your catechism that has been long a part of both mostly mainline churches. You've got your Catholic and your Anglican, but I know there's catechism. I believe there's catechism in Presbyterian churches and a number of other
yeah, I think so.
Protestant churches. That is exactly that. That's developing and working up to. And even I was over at my mom's house the other day where she had her hymnal that she got as kind of like you now have your own hymnal. Like, so again, working into
Did
that.
she have to bring it to church every Sunday?
Yeah. You didn't
didn't-
have to. They had them available, but it was kind of some kind of process where, like, you at certain age, and I'm not sure if there was a program that went along with the getting of that, but it was bestowed from the church. Like, here you've now got yours, and it had like the leaf pages and all that.
So it wasn't like there's no hymnals at the church.
No.
Okay.
But it was a part of
Yeah,
like, okay, now
that's a cool
you've reached
thing.
an age. And so I think there's lots of different ways to express that. Jonathan Haidt's work, who we've talked about lots, but his newest one, The Anxious Generation, he talks about how we're missing those in culture, period. That I think as religious expression would be really good for churches as a growing into your own maturity and growing into your own ability to stand on your own 2 feet and taking responsibility for these things. So I think the church has long had them, but for sake of... I'm not sure why we have abandoned them. I think I would guess, just the ease of trying to fit it in amongst all the rest of things and seeming that takes a lot of time to do a catechism and a lot of effort and a lot of manpower that would have to be majority voluntary run. Like there's a lot that we'd have to be asking to maintain those things. And I don't think culturally most people are looking for those, but we used to have rites of passage built in all sorts of different ways. And I know for some friends of mine, it was getting your first gun or getting your driver's license. And all those, again, we've done away with a lot of those. Of now, driver's license, I know so many youth and young adults who don't bother to get it. I couldn't wait to get mine.
Totally.
I think this Haidt would argue, it's the onlineness of our lives now that we're advancing into our experience, and now you're exposed to everything online ahead of those ages, and now you don't need a license to go visit your friends because you're connecting with them there. You don't need all these other things because everything's there. Like even he cites that Gen Z are drinking less, having less sex, and there was a number using less drugs than previous generations. And some people were like, "Yeah, look at that, we've done some work." It's like, no. It's because they're staying home and staying on Snapchat or whatever to connect with each other. They're not bothering. So we've blurred all the lines of adulthood by pushing a lot of life online that I think includes both religious and cultural expressions.
I think specifically in the context of the church,
Yep.
the video that you showed at a Donuts and Discussion night, the one with the church as a cruise ship.
Sky Jethani's video? Yeah.
And that the church went through, and he uses the cruise ship industry, and he talks about how when planes came about and all of a sudden you could fly over the ocean in 6 hours, boats were going to become obsolete.
Yeah.
So instead, the ocean liners developed the idea of cruise ships, where the means of travel became the destination. But also, the barrier of entry as a result of that became much less in the church.
Yep.
Just come to church. We just want you here in the building. So we're not going to demand anything of you. We're not going to ask anything of you. Not just, I think, on volunteers, but I think on the people who could, the young men and women who could go through a catechism.
Yep.
There's like that's putting a burden on those kids to say, hey, this is time to step up into your faith.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'm not speaking just about Living Springs, I think that culturally in the church, what we have done is we have made faith something that we offer and we encourage you to participate, but we recognize you're busy and that you've got a lot on your plate, so work with it on your time, and it's not really a priority, which is really the exact opposite of the call of Jesus to his disciples and the way the early church operated when it was like, come and die, right? That's a very different cultural expectation that we've put, and that I think in the church there would be people who have their kids in sports, and that sports team will set a standard of if your kid's going to be in this sport and they're going to be involved, here is all that is required. And people would be good with that because that sport is important. But I don't know that we've set that culture in the church that parents would be like, yes, this matters because it is at least as important as the sport they're involved in.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Cool.
Awesome.
Let you close it. I'll go behind the cameras there.
All right, I'll let you run to the cameras as I say thanks for joining us for another episode of Inverted Orthodoxy. We're glad that you send in your questions, and as Kyle already said, please keep them coming. Visit invertedorthodoxy.com. You can find the tabs there to click and send us in your questions. We love answering them. If you want to listen or watch, maybe you're only listening to this podcast, you didn't know you could watch it. You can watch it on YouTube, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can find us and listen to us on any platform that you listen to podcasts. We will see you guys again next week.
Have a great week.